So I'm Jaden Beaurain. I'm a councillor for Sholing Ward in Southampton, and I'm also the deputy leader of the Conservative group on Southampton City Council.
According to my research, crime in Southampton has slightly dipped in the last year. What efforts do you think need to be made to reduce crime further?
I think, first of all, it's important to recognise that local government plays a relatively limited role in this area. There's plenty that we can do. So working in partnership is with the police, with other services, children's services is always particularly important around tackling youth crime. But particularly in an area like Southampton, which, as you say, has a relatively high level of crime, working with national government, working with the MPs to lobby for more investment, and the Police and Crime Commissioner, of course, is essential in order to get it down. So, yeah, recognising that there's only so much that we can do, whilst also supporting the different partners where we can.
And Southampton statistically has a pretty good high level when it comes to responses to crimes. Um, is there a sort of because obviously there's a Labour administration in the council, does this affect maybe positively in a way how there would be, given how there's a central government, there's not like to be much friction, I suppose.
Well, I think actually this is one of the areas where we work very well together. It's not a particularly controversial area in lots of ways. A lot of things that we support, for instance, the support that goes to domestic violence victims, the reduction in youth crime is always very welcome, and so we're happy to work with them where we can. There are things where we think where they could go further, and obviously we have a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner in Hampshire, and so it's good to see that the Labour administration work with them. So, as I say, cross partnership working really is the way forward, and not making these things which really impact on people's lives too political an issue. And we're always happy to help where we can. We would like to see more investment in things like temporary CCTV cameras, traffic calming where residents want that and feel that it's necessary. But on the whole, we work very well, I think, with the administration in these areas.
I suppose that's true because obviously everyone wants crime to be reduced. It's obviously just how you go about reducing it, which is the potential areas of disagreement. But obviously, everyone wants crime to go down in some way. Um, in terms of the sort of breakdown of the numbers, I saw that there's a bit of a area when it comes to theft and things, or bike thefts and things at stations. And I've read a few reports of this just over the months. Is this a sort of particular area of crime that should be a focus?
Well, I think the area of theft in general is an important area to focus on for both the police and for other agencies that are involved. There's a common misconception at the moment, of course, that the police or the CPS won't prosecute thefts under £200, which is, of course, wrong. It just changes the category of the offence. And so I think that's one of the areas that the council can work on is almost a sort of communications campaign in saying that actually this is not a get out of jail free card if the value of what you've stolen is under £200, that actually you are committing an offence. But of course, all of this is dependent on the police and the courts having the right resources. And there's just one statistic which I find particularly shocking, which is that in 2023-24, the MOJ budget was 11.9 billion, whereas the DWP budget was 276 billion. And so you have this huge disparity between how governments of all parties are viewing the role of justice and how we do things like that. So really, in order to get to grips with these lower level crimes, like you've referred to, we do need to make sure that budgets like welfare are brought under control.
So I suppose it would be a matter of reducing welfare but increasing the sort of police budgets then.
Well, I just used that as an example to illustrate the disparity between things which are actually quite closely intertwined, the role of justice and of crime prevention and of welfare, but there is such a huge disparity in them. And it's not that the budget needs to be small in justice. We have an aging prison estate. Everyone knows and accepts that. We have very, very few places in the prisons. And we also have different types of crime being committed, some which may be more expensive than in the past to investigate and prosecute. So certainly there needs to be I think, a rebalancing of the priorities from a national picture, which can then feed down to how we deal with things locally.
In terms of sort of, do you think there needs to be sort of work focused on sort of maybe prison spaces then? Because obviously there's finite spaces. Do you think there needs to be work on sort of rehabilitation before sort of putting people into prison where there's maybe not enough adequate room?
Well, certainly not all criminals need or do go to prison. And I think it's right that there are certain offences where obviously you don't go to jail if you commit them, the lower level thefts and so on. However, that we need to have adequate space for those who are dangerous, who need some sort of punishment for the crime, or custodial punishment for the crimes that they've committed. And that's really difficult because you don't just build a prison overnight. They're incredibly expensive. They need to be staffed. You need to find somewhere. There's the infrastructure that goes with a prison, from taking prisoners from court to the prison estate. So although the government made an announcement a couple of weeks ago, or last week, about the new prison spaces programme, that is not going to scrape the surface in my mind. I think that they need to go much further, and we all need to recognise the problem that there is. But I would say that in 2022, when the government introduced the increase in the magistrates' court sentencing powers, we can actually look at things like that. So taking magistrate sentencing powers from 6 months to 12 months, if we can look at reforming what we've already got along those lines, then actually we might start to deal with some of the lower level offences that plague residents day to day in this city.
And do you think part of an issue might be sort of a backlog in the system, and that sort of crimes will be committed, but it'll take ages for something to work through the system for any, whether they get sentenced or whatever, whatever the outcome is?
Yeah, and of course, at all stages, because of largely because of COVID, there was there's a backlog at all stages. If the police can't deal with things, then that then impacts on the investigation, that then impacts on the file being handed to the CPS, and then the case being taken to court. So it's important that at all stages, if we're going to take, if we say that we want the lower level crimes to be taken as as seriously as they are, that whole system is pretty seamless. And like I say, that's the role that local government plays in that is particularly small. But where I think you're correct is in suggesting that prevention, making sure that we have good community infrastructure, good community policing in place to try and prevent those lower level crimes from occurring, is another good way forward. They will always happen, but trying to reduce that is another way of reducing burden on the system.
And I suppose because Southampton has much higher crime on average than Portsmouth, which obviously isn't far. Do you think there's something about maybe the way Southampton has dealt with crime in the past that has led to this sort of much higher rate compared to a neighbouring city?
I think there are well, that may well be true, but there are other factors involved as well. We're, of course, a marginally larger city. We have a merchant port predominantly, whereas Portsmouth is obviously mostly Navy, Royal Navy. And that does have an impact on the type of operation of the port that we have. The commercial imports, that naturally leads to potentially more drugs coming in, therefore more gangs. And so the sort of demographic and the layout of the city is quite different to Portsmouth. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be tackling these things. We absolutely should. And that's why I'd like to see a lot more of these community police stations reopened. I know that the Police and Crime Commission is working on that. And also ensuring that the police have the resources they need to conduct, as I just said earlier, those more complex investigations which are now emerging as time goes on. So that's not just on the ground crime, that's white collar crime, cyber crime, and so on, which of course affects all of our residents.
I suppose part of the efforts to reduce crime would be including more CCTV, as you outlined earlier, because obviously if you can spot the crime, there's more likely that something will be done about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And, of course, it's not good enough to just have the CCTV. You need to do something with the footage that you eventually gather from that. So this is what I mean by at all stages we need to have a look cross-party, I think, both locally and nationally, about how that process works. Because if you sort out the court problem, but you don't sort out the police investigatory stage of that case, then that's no use, because the cases are going to be so delayed getting to court. Evidence, the quality of evidence is not always as great if you leave it that long. And so we need to make sure that the whole system is coherent. And the other thing I would say, of course, is that with the rise of video doorbells and Ring doorbells, making sure that where crimes are committed and that those have really important evidence, that can be accessed well and also treated in such a way. Because sometimes I think there's a feeling, certainly from my residents, if something happens and they report it to the police and they say, we've got something on this Ring doorbell or whatever, that it's not taken as seriously as it would otherwise be. So I think that all of this comes back to having a coherent, structured approach from the committing of the crime all the way through to sentencing.
And do you think with the with the Ring doorbells, the police should take that more seriously, essentially, as it is sort of crucial evidence? I mean, I have noticed in the national press Ring doorbells, footage of Ring doorbells being utilised more often.
Yeah, I think they are utilised more often, but not as a sort of primary source of investigation. And I think as CCTV would be. Whereas if we are to deal with those lower level crimes, whether that's sort of antisocial behaviour that oversteps the mark, vandalism, things like criminal damage, then actually those as a means of initiating an investigation can be quite handy, or at least building up a picture of an individual. And I think that whether it's a communications issue from the police to residents, they don't often feel that they're being taken as seriously as they should be. And of course, if you live with antisocial behaviour every day, that then becomes, even if it seems quite petty, building up over time, that becomes a really big issue for a lot of people. And that's the type of area that we feel we should feel in the local authority that we can lend a hand to the police with.
I suppose with including more CCTV is kind of an interesting point, because it can help to reduce crime because there's more footage available. But of course, there's a lot of CCTV around train stations. That's obviously can be a hotbed for theft. So it's not. It can obviously help reduce crime, but it's not obviously a necessarily a guarantee, I suppose.
Well, I think it does two things. It does, like you say, it's a preventative thing. If someone is far less likely to go and mug someone at a train station if there's a CCTV camera watching over them. But also, if that does happen, that should then be used to its fullest extent possible to ensure that the crime is investigated, hopefully property returned if it's a theft, like you say, and that the individual is prosecuted.
So I suppose, yeah. So in terms of the sort of police response, it would be you would want so maybe a faster response, so it goes through the system more quickly in terms of the sort of court process as well.
Well, I think we all want a faster response, but that is only possible if the system as a whole is working effectively. So, the police, the reason why these lower level crimes are taking so long, I imagine, is because it's difficult to progress, or that the police are overworked, or there's too much going on. So that's where the prevention's really key, making sure that we're playing a role in preventing crime, but also that the police and the courts and the CPS have have the resources, I suppose, they need to do their work. And not every government is going to get it right. And I think that governments need to appreciate the scale of the challenge that they're faced with when confronting this.
Because I suppose a lot of this, as you were saying earlier, does come back from COVID, really, because there wasn't as much of a backlog before COVID, and then obviously since COVID, there's been this backlog, not just crime, but the NHS and pretty much every aspect of society, really. Do you think we're sort of 5 years out from COVID? Do you think it's getting easier, or do you think there is still a bit of a backlog when it comes to certainly crime?
Well, I think that what it feels like on the ground that things are not progressing. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, there were steps taken to try and alleviate that backlog. The one that I mentioned was the increase of the magistrates' court sentencing powers. So that does help. But it's not just the actual size of the backlog, of course. It's the inflation that came with COVID, with the war in Ukraine, which actually has made the process far more expensive. So it's not just the numbers involved, it's also the price, because it's a very, very expensive thing to enact a prosecution of someone. And, I suppose arguably, and maybe correctly, they want to focus on getting the most serious Crown Court offenders through, and also taking those ones that previously would have gone to the Crown Court into the Magistrates' Court is a more effective use of the court's time.
I suppose that's where the preventative thing comes through, because of course that will save the taxpayer more money if crimes that would otherwise been committed, don't materialise.
Yeah, and there was a view that if you commit a crime as a young person, there's a much greater emphasis on rehabilitation, on going back into society. And once you get to the age of 18, that the way that the courts deal with that and the way that the police deal with that pretty much drops off. And maybe there's an argument to be had in terms of prevention about expanding the way that we deal with young offenders. I'm not saying up to 18, I'm saying maybe 21, 22, still young people committing crimes, and making sure that they are adequately dealt with, especially for those lower level crimes where actually it doesn't need to be, if you have a short prison sentence, that doesn't need to be the end of your career or whatever you want to do in your life, but we support people back into a meaningful role into society. So you've got this preventative thing beforehand, but also preventing further crime down the line. And the youth courts and the youth justice system does a relatively good job of that on the whole. And so maybe it's time to look at expanding that further.
I suppose, yeah. So for the rehabilitation aspects, it would also be, would there be more, I don't know, I suppose like therapy or whatever they have inside prison with prison officers? Would that be something to look at?
Well, I think that the way that the youth court deals with young offenders is to do some of those things. There is obviously a punitive element to it, but just making sure that young people, whatever we draw the line on that, don't feel that this is then their whole life, is essential. And it doesn't need to be through anything in particular other than the way that we treat certain types of offenders. Obviously, there are some offenders where the purpose is either to prevent further public injury or alarm or whatever else, dangerous offenders. But there are certain offenders who start off with committing low-level crime and then end up almost on a life of crime. And I think that's sad for the individual, but it's also bad for society if we can prevent when they first commit their low-level crimes, that escalating into something else, that would be the best way forward, especially for young offenders.
And would there be, I suppose, then a different approach to rehabilitation for older offenders who have been sort of in and out?
I think it's different, and the courts do recognise that repeat offenders, you eventually start to lose, I think, some credit on your sentence. That's, it's not always as easy with people who are repeat offenders because they've proven with the resources that they've been given whilst in custody that they're not capable of changing. And I think that a lot of people would certainly feel that if we were to start sort of going softer, which is quite often how people would view a sort of rehabilitation approach, that would be unwelcome. So I think with repeat offenders who are already there and who are already committing crimes, not learning the lessons, then there needs to be a strict punitive approach. But that's not to say that we don't change how we deal with those young offenders coming through, so that by the time they are in their 40s, 50s, the sort of age you'd be when you are a repeat offender, that we haven't seen some sort of change or reduction in the need for the prison estate.
I suppose also it's a case by case basis, because some offenders might respond more positively and some might be more resistant to changing their behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this sort of goes across government and across well, at least how I view politics, is that we have to remember that everyone is an individual with different needs and different concerns. And that's when we get to a position where people are treated, just as a single group, or not viewed as having individual concerns and needs, that's when we end up in that situation. And of course, the courts, for instance, when they're considering things like bail, will consider the individual circumstances of the individual when it gets to sentencing, mitigating factors and aggravating factors and so on. So it's not that it's impersonal in the sense that they don't view the individual or the circumstances, but there is an element of, especially I think for younger offenders, once they're in that system, it's more difficult to get out. And being labelled with something which is perhaps going to cause more difficulty for the criminal justice system down the line than would otherwise be the case.
So I suppose, yeah, it is obviously quite a complex thing, really, because you're dealing with different sets of circumstances and different individual sort of motivations for enacting said crime. Because if it's a serious crime, that might be not easier to deal with in a way, but you can kind of if it's something like theft, small scale theft, that's maybe a bit easier to sort of contextualize in terms of why they've done it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's where the role of the local authority comes into play even more. Homelessness prevention, drug prevention, and so on, and all those and all the things that local authorities can do to try and prevent the things that cause people to what is often low level theft. Along with the view, of course, that you don't get prosecuted if it's under £200, which is wrong. Those types of things are really important to tackle, and then you can take those things out altogether. But of course, we want to prosecute those things because it's important to do so, and it's important that there's justice. There is a victim in low-level shoplifting and of petty damage and so on. There is always a victim. So it's important that justice is achieved for those victims. So we need to get to a position where we can prosecute those successfully, those low-level crimes, but also where hopefully we try and prevent them from occurring in the first place.
And so for the in terms of the drug route thing, is there any sort of liaison between the council and the sort of ferry companies, or not just ferries, but people who come through in the port?
I imagine that there are. I mean, you'd have to ask probably the cabinet member that's responsible for that. But I certainly know that the PCC, that's something that she's worked quite well on, is trying to tackle county lines issues, investing in the police infrastructure across the county as a whole to try and prevent that from happening. But I'm sure that the city council, like almost every council where there would be an import opportunity, is working in liaison with others, and it's that partnership approach which I said earlier, which we like to think is working well, is to promote where possible a cross-party, cross-agency approach to prevent.
And I suppose it also has a lot to do with central government as well, because how much the city council can do in terms of imports of drugs and things is maybe a bit limited. Does this sort of differ then between how a council might work with a neighbouring county council then when it's across county lines?
Well, obviously the amount of power that we have is limited by law and by how much money we have. So there's plenty of reasons why what councils can do is limited. But what I'd like to see is often a more proactive approach. So investing in things that can actively stop or deter or prevent these things from happening in the first place. But as I said earlier, I think it's going to be really difficult for the justice system as a whole, if you include the sort of lower level agencies like local authorities in that, to have the funding that they need when it's seen as almost, comparatively unimportant. And I don't think that the new government has necessarily changed that perspective, but we need to have an overall rethink as to how we see the whole process of a prosecution from the crime being committed all the way up to prosecution and either conviction or acquittal. So
do you think
I think that there is a role for local authorities in all of that, but it is at the lower end. It's at the prevention end. It's at the community engagement end, where often crimes are being committed in communities that are harder to reach, and that's why the role of local councils is important.
So I suppose do you want to see sort of heavy reform across the legal system to sort of react to this crime then?
I think it's firstly it's a funding issue, and it's not a funding issue in isolation. It's in relation to other areas. I don't think that there needs to be whole scale reform, but what I think there needs to be is a clearer way in which different government departments work with each other, different local agencies work with each other, both in a prevention and a investigatory sense, to ensure that the process is streamlined. Because often I think it feels from a resident's perspective that you make a report to the police, then nothing happens. Whereas often there is some investigation, it just takes such a long time to get anywhere. So more for the residents than for anything else, and for the people that we represent, it would be good to see that process firstly become more widely known about how, so public education on how that works, and also to create and also to save money in the long term, because that money fundamentally will need to go into the prison estates based on current projections.
So I suppose it's a matter of saving the taxpayer money and sort of accordingly adjusting the system so that essentially every penny is spent appropriately and it's not sort of underspent or overspent.
That's absolutely right. And in an area which is going to be as high spend as justice, that's going to be really essential. And I don't think it's not just saying we're going to put more money in. That's not my response to anything when I look at a sort of political or administrative situation. But it is about how you spend that money. Can we streamline the process? Can we put more money into prevention so that further down the line you save funds? Because it's far, far cheaper to prevent a crime occurring than it is to have the crime occur, conduct the investigation, prosecute, and then potentially, have a custodial sentence. So if we can get to grips with that lower level stuff, that will save, firstly, it will save a lot of money. It will stop a lot of victims having to go through the ordeal of having been victims of crime, but also will make sure that in the long run, we have fewer criminals coming through the justice system. So it's not just about whole-scale reform for the sake of reform. It's about recognising the scale of the challenge, the investment that's needed, but also where money can be saved.
So I suppose it's about, again, as you say, it's not whole-scale reform. I suppose it's selective reform. Maybe it's reforming sort of little bits and pieces, and making sure that it's maybe a more efficient system.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the system works quite well. The way that you can go to the Crown Court and appeal, and go to the Magistrates Court and appeal to the Crown Court. The fundamental basics of our system work very well. I'm not going to suggest that we get rid of jury trials and things like that, because I think that's a fundamental right that a lot of people have relied on in order to secure an acquittal. But that then shifts the focus further down the line. How the police conduct investigations, how local authorities and other partners view their role in the prevention of crime. I think if we really get to grips with the prevention element of this, then we can start to make some progress further up.